"You're going to come back in a week," Ethan Caldwell said, sliding the divorce papers across the 12-foot marble dining table. "Maybe two." Once reality hits, Claire Donovan stared at the signature line without blinking. 7 months pregnant, 30 years old, married to one of the most recognizable real estate developers in Chicago. From the outside, her life looked like something people saved to Pinterest boards and vision boards. The penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, the black SUV waiting downstairs, the charity galas, the designer dresses hanging untouched in a closet larger than most apartments. But sitting there beneath the glow of a crystal chandelier worth more than her first car, Claire felt something strange. Relief. Not sadness. Not panic. Relief. Ethan mistook her silence for shock. He leaned back in his chair, adjusting the cuff of a custom-made shirt. Confident. Relaxed. Certain he understood exactly how this story would end. He had already imagined it. The tears. The bargaining. The desperate promises. Maybe even a late-night phone call. He expected all of it. Because for 6 years, everyone in his world had treated Claire the same way. Like a beautiful accessory attached to a successful man. Like someone lucky enough to be invited into a life she could never create on her own. And now that invitation was being revoked. "I know this is hard for you," Ethan continued, his voice carrying the polished kindness people used when delivering bad news they didn't feel guilty about. "But eventually you'll understand this is for the best." Claire lowered her eyes to the papers. Her hand rested lightly against her stomach. The baby shifted, a gentle reminder that she wasn't alone. Then she smiled, just slightly, barely enough to notice. Ethan frowned. Something about that smile felt wrong. "What's funny?" he asked. Claire looked up. "Nothing." Her answer was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that made people uncomfortable. For the first time that evening, Ethan felt a flicker of uncertainty. It vanished almost immediately. He reminded himself who he was. Ethan Caldwell built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He negotiated billion-dollar projects. He appeared on magazine covers. He had spent years convincing people that he could predict outcomes before they happened. And he genuinely believed Claire was no exception. What he didn't know was that 3 floors below the penthouse, inside a locked storage room nobody had entered in over 4 years, there were 14 bankers' boxes filled with notebooks. Hundreds of pages. Every sketch. Every strategy. Every business model. Every expansion proposal that transformed Caldwell Development from a struggling local company into a national powerhouse. All written by Claire. He didn't know they existed. Nobody did. Not yet. Claire reached for the pen. Ethan watched carefully, waiting for hesitation, waiting for fear, waiting for proof that he still mattered more than her pride. Instead, she signed her name in less than 5 seconds. Claire Donovan. Smooth. Effortless. Final. The scratching sound of ink against paper echoed through the silent room. Ethan stared at the signature. Somehow it felt louder than an argument. Louder than tears. Louder than a slammed door. "That's it?" he asked. Claire placed the pen down. "That's it." The city lights shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Hundreds of thousands of people moved through their ordinary lives below. Most of them would have looked at Ethan Caldwell and assumed he had everything. Wealth. Influence. Control. But what happened next would reveal a truth nobody saw coming. Because the woman he believed would beg him to stay was carrying a secret that could explain his entire success. And within 2 years, Ethan would discover the most expensive mistake of his life wasn't ending his marriage. It was underestimating the person who had built his future while standing quietly in the background. 3 days later, Claire stood in the checkout line of a neighborhood grocery store on the north side of Chicago holding a basket with exactly 6 items. Milk, bread, apples, yogurt, bottled water, and a small container of mint chocolate chip ice cream she had been craving all week. The total came to $42.16. She paid with her own debit card and smiled when the cashier wished her luck with the baby. Nobody recognized her. Nobody knew she had spent the last 6 years attending black tie fundraisers beside one of the most powerful businessmen in the city. Nobody knew she had left a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. And for the first time in a very long time, that anonymity felt wonderful. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan Caldwell sat at the head of a conference table surrounded by executives discussing a $70 million mixed-use development project. He should have been focused. Instead, he kept checking his phone. No missed calls. No messages. No emotional emails. Nothing from Claire. The silence irritated him more than he cared to admit. By now she should have reached out. Even if not to reconcile, then at least to discuss money, housing, or the future. That was how these situations worked. At least that was how Ethan believed they worked. He glanced at his phone again. Still nothing. One of the executives noticed. Everything okay? Ethan straightened in his chair. Of course. But the answer sounded less convincing than he intended. That evening he opened social media expecting to find some clue about her life. A sad quote. A complaint. A sign that she was struggling. Instead he found absolutely nothing. Claire had disappeared. No posts. No photos. No updates. It was as if she had stepped completely out of the world he controlled. The next morning Ethan received an unexpected call from his mother. Patricia Caldwell had spent decades moving comfortably through elite social circles. She knew everybody worth knowing and usually knew their secrets before they became public. I saw Claire yesterday, she said. Ethan looked up from his desk. Where? A coffee shop. And Patricia hesitated. She looked happy. Ethan almost laughed. Happy. That is what surprised me. The comment lingered long after the call ended. Happy was not part of the script. Neither was confident. Yet over the next several weeks, similar reports continued arriving from unexpected places. A former neighbor mentioned seeing Claire walking along the lakefront. A charity board member claimed she looked more relaxed than she had in years. Even Ethan's younger sister casually remarked, honestly, she seems lighter. Lighter. The word bothered him. Because while Claire appeared to be moving forward, Ethan felt strangely stuck. One evening he wandered into his home office searching for a file and found an old photograph tucked inside a drawer. It had been taken 6 years earlier in a cramped apartment before Caldwell Development became nationally recognized. In the picture, Ethan looked exhausted. Claire sat beside him at a tiny kitchen table covered with sketches, maps, and legal pads. He remembered that apartment. The sleepless nights. The endless planning sessions. The impossible obstacles. Back then success felt distant. He stared at the photograph longer than he expected. Something felt off. A memory lingered just beyond reach. Before he could place it, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of one of his senior project managers. Ethan answered immediately. Tell me you have good news. There was a pause. Actually, we have a problem. Ethan's expression hardened. What kind of problem? The Riverside proposal. The city rejected the revised development strategy. Ethan frowned. That made no sense. The proposal followed the same expansion model that had worked repeatedly over the years. Send me everything, he said. After ending the call, he stared again at the old photograph on his desk. For some reason, his eyes settled not on himself, but on Claire. On the notebook open in front of her. On the pages filled with handwritten notes. And for the first time, a question entered his mind that had never occurred to him before. What if he had misunderstood who was really sitting at that table all those years ago? The Riverside rejection should have been a minor setback. Caldwell Development had survived zoning disputes, market downturns, and political shifts before. Yet as Ethan sat alone in his office overlooking the Chicago skyline, the thick packet of notes from the City Planning Committee felt strangely personal. He flipped through page after page of criticism. Lack of community integration, weak retail projections, insufficient long-term sustainability planning. The comments irritated him because they sounded familiar, not the problems themselves, the solutions that were missing. For years, proposals from Caldwell Development had impressed city officials precisely because they anticipated concerns before they were raised. Somehow this one had not. Ethan leaned back and stared at the ceiling. Then another memory surfaced. Claire sitting cross-legged on the floor of their first apartment with colored markers spread across the carpet. She used to study development projects for hours, asking questions nobody else asked. Where would families gather? How would local businesses benefit? What would the neighborhood look like 10 years later instead of 1 year later? At the time, Ethan considered those conversations helpful background noise. Now he was not so sure. 2 days later, he ordered a complete review of archived project files. His executive assistant looked confused. You want files from 6 years ago? Everything, Ethan replied. Every proposal, every draft, every revision. By Friday afternoon, dozens of boxes filled a conference room. Ethan spent hours going through old documents. Most contained exactly what he expected. Financial forecasts, legal reviews, construction schedules. Then he found something unusual. A draft proposal for a mixed-use development in Milwaukee. Attached behind the executive summary was a handwritten page. No company letterhead. No official formatting. Just notes written in blue ink. Questions. Recommendations. Community outreach ideas. Retail placement strategies. Public space concepts. At the bottom of the page sat a familiar signature. Claire. Ethan stared at it for several seconds. He opened another file. Then another. Then another. The pattern repeated. Handwritten notes. Strategic observations. Margin comments. Suggestions that later appeared almost word for word in the final approved proposals. Every major project during the company's growth years seemed to contain traces of her thinking. By midnight, the conference room table was covered in documents. Ethan felt a pressure building in his chest. Not fear. Not yet. Something closer to disbelief. The next morning, he drove to a storage facility on the north side of the city, a place the company rented years earlier before moving into luxury headquarters. Most units had been emptied long ago. One remained under an old contract. Ethan almost left when the manager told him the records were outdated. Then curiosity pushed him forward. Inside the dusty unit sat shelves packed with bankers' boxes. 14 of them. Exactly as if someone had carefully preserved a forgotten history. Ethan opened the nearest box. Notebooks. Legal pads. Folders. Hundreds upon hundreds of pages. Development concepts. Market analyses. Expansion strategies. Entire frameworks for projects that eventually generated millions of dollars. His hands moved faster as he searched through the material. Every notebook belonged to Claire. Every page carried her handwriting. Every idea seemed connected to a decision he had later presented as his own. Outside, a freight train rumbled past the industrial district, shaking the building slightly. Ethan barely noticed. For the first time in years, he was looking at evidence he could not explain away. Then he found something even more disturbing. Tucked inside the final notebook was a sealed envelope with his name written across the front. The date on the envelope was 3 years old. 3 years. It had been sitting there the entire time, waiting. Ethan stared at the handwriting, suddenly unsure whether he wanted to know what was inside. The envelope felt heavier than paper should have felt. Ethan stood alone in the storage unit, surrounded by boxes that had quietly preserved a version of history he had never bothered to examine. For several moments, he simply stared at his name written in Claire's neat handwriting. Then he carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single letter folded 3 times. The date immediately caught his attention. 3 years earlier. Long before the divorce. Long before the silence. Long before he ever imagined Claire would walk away without looking back. Ethan unfolded the page. The first sentence stopped him cold. If you are reading this, then something finally forced you to look where you never wanted to look. His eyes moved down the page. Claire's words were calm. Not angry. Not bitter. Somehow that made them harder to read. She wrote about the early years of Caldwell development. The tiny apartment. The endless nights spent reviewing proposals. The dreams they built together. She described how proud she had been watching the company grow. She described believing they were partners even when nobody else saw them that way. Then the letter changed. Slowly. Quietly. Claire explained that over time she had noticed something disappearing. Not money. Not success. Respect. Meetings where her ideas were presented without her name attached. Interviews where Ethan spoke as if every breakthrough had appeared from his own imagination. Award ceremonies where people congratulated him while she stood smiling in the background. She never accused him directly. She simply described moments. Dozens of them. Small moments that formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Ethan continued reading. I do not think you meant to erase me at first, one paragraph began. I think you just became accustomed to being the person everyone applauded. His jaw tightened. The storage unit suddenly felt smaller. The next section unsettled him even more. Claire revealed that she had deliberately stopped contributing new ideas 2 years earlier as an experiment. She wanted to see whether Ethan would notice, whether he would ask questions, whether he would realize something was missing. According to the letter, he never did. Instead, he hired consultants, expanded departments, increased budgets, yet somehow never noticed the absence of the person who had once challenged every assumption in the room. Ethan lowered the paper. A distant train horn echoed through the industrial district outside. He remembered those years. The projects becoming harder. The decisions feeling less certain. The unexplained frustration he blamed on market conditions. Slowly, a realization began taking shape. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Like a photograph developing in reverse. He looked back at the letter. Near the bottom of the final page, Claire had written something that made his stomach drop. The company will survive without me. I genuinely hope it does. But if one day you begin wondering why everything suddenly feels more difficult, do not ask where the answers went. Ask why you stopped listening to them. Ethan read the sentence twice, then 3 times. By the time he reached the signature at the bottom, the afternoon sunlight had faded. Shadows stretched across the concrete floor. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. For the first time in years, he did not feel powerful. He felt uncertain. That same evening, 70 miles away, Claire sat on the balcony of a modest condominium overlooking a small park. Her newborn son slept peacefully inside. A warm summer breeze drifted through the open door. Across the table sat a man named Daniel Mercer. He listened quietly as Claire reviewed a business concept she had been developing for months. No interruptions. No assumptions. No need to prove herself. When she finished speaking, Daniel smiled. "You know," he said, closing the notebook in front of him, "most consultants would charge a fortune for insights like these." Claire laughed softly. "Good thing I am not most consultants." Daniel nodded. Then he said something neither of them realized would change everything. "The real question is not whether these ideas work. The real question is whether you are finally ready to put your own name on them." Claire did not answer Daniel immediately. She looked through the balcony railing toward the small neighborhood park below where parents pushed strollers along winding sidewalks and children chased each other beneath rows of maple trees. For years, she had watched life through the windows of boardrooms, private lounges, and luxury events. Now she found herself studying ordinary moments as if they were priceless. Inside the condominium, her son stirred briefly in his crib before settling back to sleep. The sound made her smile. "I am not sure I want to build another empire," she finally said. Daniel folded his hands. "Good. The people obsessed with building empires usually make terrible leaders." Claire laughed softly. "Then what do you think I should build?" Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "Something that belongs to you." The word stayed with her long after he left that evening. Over the following weeks, Claire began working during the quiet hours when her son slept. A small desk near the living room window became her headquarters. No executive assistants. No conference rooms. No expensive presentations. Just notebooks, research reports, and years of experience that had never officially carried her name. She started by helping a local developer reorganize a struggling project. Then another client arrived through a referral. Then another. Every recommendation led to 2 more. By the end of the summer, her calendar was full. What surprised Claire most was not the demand. It was how much she enjoyed the work. Nobody expected her to stand in the background. Nobody interrupted her explanations. Nobody treated her ideas as invisible. Meanwhile, at Caldwell Development, problems continued appearing in places Ethan had never worried about before. A major project in Indianapolis exceeded budget projections. A retail partnership unexpectedly collapsed. 2 senior executives resigned within the same month. None of the setbacks were catastrophic individually. Together, however, they created a pattern. Investors began asking difficult questions. Board members requested additional reviews. Industry reporters noticed the shift. One Friday afternoon, Ethan attended a meeting with potential partners for a waterfront development. Halfway through the presentation, one investor raised a concern about community engagement and long-term occupancy projections. Ethan provided a polished answer. The investor remained unconvinced. Another question followed. Then another. By the end of the meeting, the room felt noticeably colder. Driving back to headquarters, Ethan found himself thinking about Claire again. Not because he missed the marriage. At least that was what he told himself. He kept thinking about solutions. About the strange ability she once had to identify weaknesses before anyone else noticed them. That night, he opened one of her notebooks again. Then another. Hours passed. The city lights outside his office dimmed as buildings across downtown gradually went dark. Ethan barely noticed. Every page revealed the same thing. Claire had not simply contributed ideas. She had anticipated outcomes, predicted obstacles, asked questions nobody else thought to ask. Near midnight, his phone buzzed with a notification from an industry publication. He opened the article absent-mindedly, then froze. The headline featured a photograph he had never expected to see. Claire stood on a stage addressing a regional development conference. The article described her as an emerging strategic consultant whose innovative planning methods were attracting attention throughout the Midwest. Ethan read the paragraph twice, then 3 times. At the bottom of the article was a quote from one of her clients. "Working with Claire Donovan changed our entire approach. She sees opportunities years before everyone else." Ethan stared at the screen in silence. Across town, Claire closed her laptop after finishing another successful proposal. Her phone vibrated with an incoming email. The sender's name immediately caught her attention. Daniel Mercer. The message contained only one sentence. "I think it is time we discuss something much bigger than consulting." Claire read the email 3 times before responding. The next morning, she met Daniel at a quiet restaurant overlooking the Chicago River. It was the kind of place where conversations mattered more than appearances. No cameras, no reporters, no executives competing for attention. Daniel arrived carrying a slim leather portfolio and ordered coffee before getting straight to the point. "I have spent the last 6 months watching what you have built," he said. "Not because I was curious, because I was impressed." Claire smiled politely. "That sounds expensive." Daniel laughed. "It was worth every dollar." Then he slid the portfolio across the table. Claire opened it slowly. Inside were market reports, investment projections, and a detailed business plan. The company name at the top immediately caught her attention. Donovan Strategic Partners. She looked up. "What is this?" Daniel leaned back. "An opportunity." Claire continued reading. The proposal outlined a national consulting firm focused on urban development, long-term planning. Everything reflected the same principles she had spent years refining. Everything carried her name. "Daniel, this would require a serious amount of capital." "I know. And a team. Already considered. And clients willing to trust a new company." Daniel smiled. "You already have those." Claire closed the folder. Her heart raced. Not from fear. From possibility. For years she had been helping other people build futures. Now someone was asking her to build her own. Across downtown, Ethan sat through another frustrating board meeting. Revenue remained strong, but confidence was slipping. Investors wanted explanations. Analysts wanted forecasts. The board wanted answers. Ethan offered all 3, yet nobody seemed reassured. As the meeting ended, one director lingered behind. "Can I be honest?" the man asked. Ethan nodded. "The company feels different lately." Ethan forced a smile. "Every company goes through cycles. This does not feel like a cycle." The comment stayed with him long after the room emptied. Later that evening, he returned to his office and opened another article about Claire. There were more now. Industry publications, conference summaries, podcasts. Her name appeared everywhere. One headline described her as one of the most innovative strategic minds in regional development. Another praised her ability to predict long-term market shifts with unusual accuracy. Ethan stared at the screen. None of these articles described a former executive's wife. They described a respected professional, someone earning recognition entirely on her own. For reasons he could not explain, that realization hurt more than criticism from investors ever had. Weeks passed. Autumn arrived. Leaves turned gold along Michigan Avenue. Construction cranes continued rising across the skyline. And Donovan Strategic Partners officially launched. The announcement spread faster than anyone expected. Existing clients signed immediately. New inquiries flooded in. Industry leaders requested meetings. By the end of the first month, Claire had hired 5 employees. By the end of the second, she needed additional office space. Daniel watched the growth with quiet satisfaction. One afternoon, he stopped by the office carrying a newspaper. He placed it on Claire's desk without saying a word. She looked down at the front page of the business section. There was a photograph of her speaking at a conference. Beneath it sat a headline she never imagined seeing. Former industry insider builds fastest growing development advisory firm in the Midwest. Claire stared at the article in silence. Years earlier, she would have celebrated with excitement. Now she felt something different. Peace. Because for the first time, success belonged entirely to her. Yet neither she nor Daniel knew that someone else had already seen the same headline. And as Ethan Caldwell stared at the newspaper from his office window 60 floors above the city, a decision began forming in his mind. A decision that would bring their paths together again much sooner than either of them expected. 2 years after signing the divorce papers, Claire walked through the glass doors of Donovan Strategic Partners' new headquarters carrying a cup of coffee and a tablet filled with meeting notes. The office occupied 3 floors of a renovated building overlooking the Chicago River. Sunlight poured through the windows. Employees moved with purpose. Conversations centered around ideas, not titles. Every corner reflected the culture she had spent years imagining but never had the chance to create. As she crossed the lobby, a young analyst hurried over. "The Denver presentation was approved this morning," he said. Claire smiled. "That makes 3 cities this week." The analyst shook his head in amazement. "For if Seattle confirms this afternoon." Claire thanked him and continued toward the elevator. Moments like this still felt unreal. Not because of the growth, because of the freedom. Every success now carried her own name. Meanwhile, several miles away, Ethan sat alone inside a conference room that once felt too small for his ambitions. Today it felt empty. Quarterly reports covered the polished table. Revenue remained respectable, but the numbers told a deeper story. Growth had slowed. Opportunities were shrinking. Competitors were adapting faster. For the first time in his career, Ethan found himself reacting instead of leading. His chief financial officer entered carrying another folder. "You need to see this." Ethan accepted the report. Halfway through the first page, his expression tightened. Another major client had chosen a different consulting partner for a multi-million-dollar project. He looked at the company name, Donovan Strategic Partners. The room fell silent. Ethan read the page again. Then another. Then another. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Claire's company was not merely growing. It was reshaping the market. Projects once considered automatic wins for Caldwell Development were now being influenced by strategies developed through her firm. Ethan closed the folder slowly. "How many times has this happened?" he asked. The chief financial officer hesitated. "More than you would like." That evening, Ethan attended a private industry reception hosted at one of Chicago's most prestigious hotels. The ballroom sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers. Executives exchanged business cards. Investors discussed future developments. Years earlier, Ethan would have been the center of attention. Tonight felt different. Conversations shifted when another guest entered the room. Heads turned. Phones appeared. Ethan followed the movement and immediately understood why. Claire had arrived. She wore a simple navy dress and carried herself with quiet confidence. No entourage, no performance, no attempt to impress anyone. Yet people gravitated toward her instantly. Developers, journalists, investors, city officials. They all wanted a few minutes of her time. Ethan watched from across the room. Something about the scene unsettled him. Not because Claire looked successful, because she looked comfortable, as if she no longer needed validation from anyone. Daniel Mercer stood nearby speaking with several investors. At one point, he glanced toward Claire and smiled. She returned the smile naturally. The exchange lasted only seconds, but Ethan felt an unexpected sting. Not jealousy, regret, a different emotion. The realization that while he had spent years chasing expansion, recognition, and influence, Claire had built something far more valuable. A life that no longer revolved around proving herself. Later that night, after most guests had left, Ethan stepped outside onto a quiet terrace overlooking the city. The skyline stretched across the darkness in a sea of lights. Behind him, conversations faded. Ahead of him, traffic moved through the streets below. Then his phone vibrated. A calendar reminder appeared on the screen. National Development Summit. 3 weeks away. The largest industry conference of the year. Ethan almost dismissed the notification until he noticed one additional detail. The keynote speaker had just been announced. Claire Donovan. Ethan stared at the screen for several seconds. Because for the first time since the divorce, he realized their next meeting would not happen in private. It would happen in front of the entire industry. The National Development Summit filled the largest convention center in Chicago. More than 3,000 executives, investors, city planners, and journalists occupied the massive auditorium. Giant screens illuminated the stage. Cameras streamed every session live across the country. Conversations echoed through the hallways as attendees debated trends, projects, and predictions about the future of American development. Yet one topic dominated nearly every discussion. Claire Donovan. By the morning of the keynote address, every seat had been filled. Additional guests stood along the walls. Reporters adjusted microphones. Photographers prepared their cameras. Near the back of the room, Ethan Caldwell sat quietly among the audience. Years ago, he would have occupied the front row automatically. Today, nobody seemed to notice his arrival. The realization bothered him more than he expected. The lights dimmed. The moderator stepped onto the stage and introduced the keynote speaker. Applause erupted immediately. Then Claire appeared. She walked confidently toward the podium while the audience rose to its feet. The standing ovation lasted nearly 20 seconds. Ethan remained seated at first, then slowly joined the crowd. Not because he felt obligated, because he suddenly understood what everyone else already saw. Claire began speaking without dramatic gestures or rehearsed enthusiasm. Her voice was calm, direct, authentic. She spoke about cities, communities, and long-term planning. She spoke about sustainable growth and responsible leadership. She spoke about listening before making decisions. Every point felt practical. Every example felt real. The audience leaned forward. Nobody checked their phones. Nobody left their seats. Then Claire displayed a slide showing the development of several successful projects completed over the last decade. Ethan's attention sharpened immediately. Some of the projects belonged to Caldwell Development. Claire looked across the audience before continuing. The greatest mistake many leaders make is believing success belongs to one person, she said. The room grew quiet. Every achievement is built by people whose contributions are often invisible. Several audience members nodded. Others began taking notes. Claire continued. The strongest organizations are not built on ego. They are built on recognition. The moment leaders stop listening, they stop growing. Ethan felt those words settle heavily in his chest. Not because she sounded angry. She did not. Not because she was attacking anyone. She was not. What unsettled him was the truth behind them. For years, he had believed leadership meant being the smartest person in the room. Looking around the auditorium, he realized Claire had built influence through an entirely different approach. She made other people feel seen. She made them feel valuable. The presentation ended with another standing ovation. This time it lasted even longer. Investors approached the stage. Journalists lined up for interviews. Industry leaders waited patiently for a chance to speak with her. Ethan remained seated while the crowd gradually dispersed. From a distance, he watched Claire greet people with the same quiet confidence she had displayed throughout the presentation. No arrogance. No need to prove anything. Hours later, a private reception followed the conference. Invitations had been limited to senior executives and major investors. Ethan attended reluctantly. He considered leaving several times before finally spotting Claire near a large window overlooking the river. She stood alone for the first time all evening. The opportunity felt impossible to ignore. Taking a slow breath, Ethan crossed the room. Claire turned as he approached. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, neither spoke. 2 years of distance seemed to hang between them. Finally, Ethan stopped a few feet away. "Congratulations," he said quietly. Claire smiled politely. "Thank you." The conversation could have ended there. Perhaps it should have. Yet as the city lights reflected across the river beyond the glass, Ethan realized there was one thing he could no longer avoid saying. And for the first time in years, he was not certain how the words would be received. For a moment, neither of them moved. The noise of the reception seemed distant now, reduced to a soft murmur beneath the glow of city lights reflecting across the river. Ethan looked at Claire and realized something he should have understood years ago. The woman standing in front of him was not the same person who had signed those divorce papers. Then again, neither was he. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. Claire studied him without speaking. Ethan gave a small laugh that carried no humor. "Actually, I owe you a lot more than that." The honesty surprised even him. For years he had been able to explain away mistakes, rationalize decisions, convince himself that success justified everything. Standing here now, none of those excuses seemed useful. "After you left, I started finding things," he continued. "The notebooks, the proposals, the letter." Claire's expression softened slightly at the mention of the letter. "I never expected you to read it. I almost wish I had not." She raised an eyebrow. Ethan shook his head, not because of what it said, because of what it made me realize. The silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, just honest. For once, neither of them was pretending. "I spent years believing I built everything myself," Ethan said. "I told that story so many times that eventually I believed it." Claire looked out toward the river. "People usually believe the stories that benefit them." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know. He hesitated before continuing. The truth is, I thought you would come back. Claire glanced at him. I know. I thought you would call. Or ask for help. Or tell me I had made a mistake. A faint smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. And when I did not, Ethan looked down briefly. I kept waiting. The answer hung in the air. Simple. Embarrassing. Real. For the first time since the divorce, Claire felt no anger. No resentment. Only clarity. She finally understood that Ethan had never truly expected to lose her. He had expected to lose the marriage and keep the certainty that she would always remain within reach. The distinction mattered. You know what is strange? Claire asked. Ethan shook his head. When I left, everyone thought I was losing something. She looked around the room filled with investors, executives, and industry leaders. But it turned out I was making space. Ethan followed her gaze. He understood exactly what she meant. A movement near the entrance caught Claire's attention. Daniel had arrived after finishing another meeting across town. Their eyes met briefly. He smiled. She smiled back. The exchange lasted only a second, yet Ethan noticed it immediately. Oddly, it did not hurt. It simply confirmed something he already knew. Claire's future no longer depended on him. Perhaps it never should have. How is your son? Ethan asked. Claire's face brightened instantly. He is wonderful. There was no hesitation in her answer. No qualification. No uncertainty. Just pride. Ethan smiled. I am glad. And for the first time, he genuinely meant it. A few minutes later, the reception began winding down. Guests gathered coats and exchanged final handshakes. Claire picked up her bag. I should go. Ethan nodded. There were 100 things he could have said. 100 ways to revisit the past. Instead, he chose honesty one last time. I underestimated you. Claire looked at him carefully. Then she shook her head. No. Ethan frowned slightly. No. Claire smiled. You underestimated yourself. He looked confused. She continued. The company survived. You learned. You changed. That matters too. For several seconds, Ethan could not respond. Then he laughed softly. Trust you to find the lesson in all of this. Claire laughed as well. Occupational hazard. They walked toward the exit together before stopping near the doors. Beyond the glass, the city stretched into the distance beneath a clear night sky. Ethan watched as Claire stepped outside. Daniel joined her a moment later. Together they disappeared into the crowd moving along the river walk. Ethan remained where he was. Not lonely. Not defeated. Just thoughtful. Years earlier he believed success meant being the person everyone applauded. Tonight he finally understood something different. The most valuable people in your life are often the ones standing quietly beside you while you build your dreams. And if you are fortunate enough to recognize their worth before they leave, you keep more than a partnership. You keep the foundation beneath everything that matters.